The surgical lights blazed overhead as Dr. Rachel Bennett's gloved hands froze mid-incision. For 30 years, she'd opened bodies without hesitation. But now, her fingers trembled above the 15-year-old boy's abdomen. "Doctor," her assistant whispered. Rachel couldn't speak. Inside the massive tumor she'd just exposed, illuminated by the unforgiving OR lights, were things that shouldn't exist. Fully formed teeth, long, silky blonde hair, fragments of bone arranged in patterns she recognized, ribs, vertebrae, part of a tiny skull, and there, unmistakably, tissue that resembled developing brain matter. "Oh my God," she finally breathed. "It's not just a tumor." The heart monitor beeped steadily. Ethan Sullivan, the boy the internet had cruelly nicknamed the pregnant boy, lay open before her, carrying inside him what looked horrifyingly like the remains of another human being. But to understand how they'd arrived at this moment of medical horror, you need to go back 6 months to a high school cafeteria in West Virginia. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The autumn sun filtered through dusty windows of Silver Creek Trailer Park, casting long shadows across Lot 47. Inside the cramped mobile home, Margaret Sullivan, everyone called her Maggie, poured coffee with hands that never quite stopped moving. At 38, she looked older. 2 jobs will do that. The morning shift at Save Mart started in an hour, and the evening shift at Pete's Diner wouldn't end until 10. Between them, she earned just enough to keep the lights on and her son fed. Her wedding ring caught the light as she set down the pot. 12 years widowed, and she still wore it. Tom Sullivan had been gone since 2007, but Maggie couldn't bring herself to remove that thin gold band. It was all she had left of him. Besides their son and that broken-down Chevy rusting under a tarp in the yard. "Ethan, breakfast," she called, glancing at the kitchen clock. 15-year-old Ethan emerged from his bedroom. Sandy blonde hair uncombed, wearing one of his father's old flannel shirts. The shirt hung loose on his frame, or at least it used to. Lately, Maggie had noticed it fitting differently around his middle, pulling tight in a way that made her stomach clench with unnamed worry. "Morning, Mom." His voice was quiet, always quiet. He grabbed a piece of toast, avoiding her eyes. Maggie watched him eat standing up, one hand unconsciously resting on his abdomen, a gesture she'd seen more and more lately. "You feeling okay, baby?" "Fine." The word came too quick. "You sure you've been—" "I'm fine, Mom. Just tired." He turned away, reaching for his backpack, and Maggie caught a glimpse of his profile. Was his stomach more rounded than last month? She'd blamed Betty Lou's generous cooking. Their neighbor had been feeding Ethan since he was 3. Trying to fill the hole Tom's death had left. The old Zenith radio on the counter crackled to life. Tom's favorite song, bleeding through static, "You Send Me," by Sam Cooke. Maggie's throat tightened. That radio had been temperamental for years, only playing when it wanted to, always that same song. Tom used to joke it was magic. "I gotta go," Ethan said, already heading for the door. "Wait." Maggie grabbed his arm gently. "You'd tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you?" His hazel eyes. Tom's eyes met hers briefly. "Sure, Mom." He was lying. She knew her son. But single mothers working 70 hours a week learned to pick their battles, and school started in 20 minutes. "Love you, baby. Love you too. The door closed, and Maggie stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the radio that had fallen silent again, wondering why her mother's instinct was screaming that something was terribly, terribly wrong. September arrived with the kind of heat that made West Virginia shimmer. Ethan stood in the boys' locker room at Brooksville High, waiting until the other students left before changing for gym class. The strategy had worked for weeks, but today Coach Thompson blew his whistle early. "Sullivan, you planning to join us today or next semester?" Ethan's hands fumbled with his shirt buttons. Around him, boys stripped down without self-consciousness, their bodies lean and uncomplicated. His wasn't any more. When he pulled off his T-shirt, he kept his back to the room, reaching quickly for his gym clothes. "Dude, are you getting fat?" Tyler Morris laughed, not cruelly, just observing. Ethan's face burned. Just been eating a lot. But it wasn't fat, not really. His abdomen had taken on a strange firmness, a roundness that pressed against his jeans waistband and made him feel perpetually full. He'd stopped eating lunch weeks ago, unable to finish even half a sandwich before the uncomfortable pressure made him stop. In gym class, they played dodgeball. Ethan usually enjoyed it, one of the few activities where being quiet was an advantage. He could dodge and weave, invisible until he wasn't. But today, as the red rubber ball hurtled toward him, he moved too slowly. It slammed into his stomach with a dull thud that sent pain radiating through his entire abdomen. He doubled over, gasping. "Sullivan!" Coach Thompson jogged over. "You okay, son?" Ethan couldn't speak. The pain was unlike anything he'd felt before, sharp and deep, as if something inside him had shifted. He pressed both hands against his belly, willing the agony to subside. "Nurse!" Now, the coach's voice had lost its usual barking quality. Mrs. Davies, the school nurse, had been working at Brooksville High for 23 years. She'd seen everything from broken bones to teenage pregnancy scares. But when Ethan Sullivan walked into her office, hunched and pale, something in her experienced gut twisted. "Lift your shirt, sweetheart." Ethan hesitated, then complied. Mrs. Davies pulled out her measuring tape. She kept one for tracking student growth charts and wrapped it around his abdomen. Her eyebrows rose. 34 inches? She wrote it down, then measured again to be sure. "Ethan, honey, that's... How long has your stomach been like this?" He shrugged, pulling his shirt down quickly. "I don't know. A while." "Does it hurt?" "Sometimes. Mostly just feels full." Mrs. Davies sat back in her chair, studying him. Average waist measurement for a 15-year-old boy was 28 to 30 inches. 34 was significant, especially on Ethan's otherwise thin frame. "Any injuries lately?" "Falls car accidents." "No, ma'am." She made a note. "Playing contact sports." "No." "Have you told your mother?" Silence answered her. Mrs. Davies sighed. She'd gone to school with Maggie Sullivan, back when Maggie was Maggie Porter and had dreams of becoming a nurse herself. She knew about Tom's death, knew about the double shifts, knew that medical care wasn't something the Sullivans could afford casually. "Ethan, I'm going to call your mom. You need to see a doctor." "Please don't." His voice cracked. "She's already." "We can't. This isn't optional, sweetie." The phone call was brief. Mrs. Davies kept her voice professional, not wanting to alarm Maggie at work, but firm enough to convey urgency. He needs medical attention. Today, if possible. 3 days later, Maggie used a sick day unpaid to drive Ethan 30 miles to Harmony Free Clinic. The waiting room was packed with people who looked like them worn out, struggling, choosing between medicine and groceries. They waited 3.5 hours, Ethan's head resting on his mother's shoulder while daytime television droned overhead. Dr. Patterson was 72 and should have retired a decade ago. But Harmony couldn't afford to replace him. His hands shook slightly as he examined Ethan's abdomen, pressing gently, feeling the unusual firmness beneath the skin. For a moment, his fingers stilled completely. His face went carefully blank. "How long?" he asked. "Few months, maybe," Ethan admitted. Dr. Patterson stepped back, removing his gloves. He scribbled on a prescription pad, his handwriting shaky. "Reduce sodium intake, cut out sodas and processed foods. Increase exercise walking, nothing too strenuous. Come back in 2 weeks." "Should we do tests?" Maggie asked, her voice small. She'd seen the number posted in the waiting room: basic blood work, $200, ultrasound, $500, CT scan, $1,500, each number a calculation against rent, groceries, electricity. Dr. Patterson met her eyes. In them, she saw something that terrified her more than his words. Pity. "Let's try lifestyle modifications first. See if that helps." Outside, in the parking lot of her 26-year-old Honda, Maggie gripped the steering wheel and tried not to cry. Ethan sat silent in the passenger seat, one hand resting on his swollen abdomen, both of them pretending everything would be fine. November arrived cold and unforgiving. Ethan's abdomen had grown to 36 inches, and the whispers at school had evolved into something crueler. It started as a joke someone made in the hallway between third and fourth period, a thoughtless comment about Ethan looking pregnant. By lunch, it had spread like wildfire. He tried to hide in the library, but hunger forced him to the cafeteria. The moment he walked through the double doors, carrying his tray with both hands to avoid putting pressure on his stomach, the room seemed to shift. Conversations paused, heads turned. Brad Hutchins, senior linebacker with a football scholarship to Marshall University, and the kind of casual cruelty that comes from never having struggled, stood up from his table, his voice carried across the entire cafeteria. "Hey, everyone, the pregnant boy is back." Laughter erupted. Not everyone. Some students looked uncomfortable. A few even sympathetic, but enough. Enough that Ethan felt his face burn, his hands start to shake. The tray wobbled, milk carton trembling. Someone had their phone out. Of course they did. This was 2018, and nothing happened anymore without documentation. "Dude, when's the baby due?" Brad continued, encouraged by the attention. "You gonna name it, have a gender reveal party?" More laughter. Ethan stood frozen, unable to move forward or back. A single tear escaped down his cheek before he could stop it, and he wiped it away quickly, roughly, but not before the phone camera caught it. "Leave him alone!" "Brad!" The voice came from Sarah Chen, honor roll student and one of the few people who'd ever been kind to Ethan, but her protest was drowned in the noise. Ethan set his tray down on the nearest table and walked out. He didn't run. That would have been worse somehow. He just walked. one foot in front of the other, hands pressed against his swollen abdomen, feeling the weight of every eye on him. The video was posted to TikTok within the hour. By evening, it had 10,000 views. By midnight, 100,000. By morning, 2.3 million people had watched Ethan Sullivan stand in his high school cafeteria, trying not to cry while his classmates called him pregnant. The hashtag was #pregnantboy. Comments flooded in. Most were cruel jokes about teenage pregnancy, about his weight, about his obvious poverty visible in his second-hand clothes. Some were confused, genuinely asking what was medically wrong with him. A few were concerned, suggesting child protective services, better sex education, parental neglect. Nobody thought to ask if he was sick. Betty Lou Parker showed the video to Maggie at 11 o'clock that night. Maggie had just gotten home from her evening shift at Pete's Diner, feet aching, smelling like fryer grease. Betty Lou lived in the trailer next door and had been watching out for the Sullivans since Tom died. "Honey, you need to see this." Betty Lou's voice was gentle, the way you speak to someone about to receive bad news. Maggie watched the 47-second video 3 times. Each viewing felt like a knife twisting in her chest. Her baby, her quiet, gentle boy who'd never hurt anyone, who still talked to his father's photograph when he thought she couldn't hear, who spent Saturdays helping Mr. Henderson at the auto shop for minimum wage to contribute to household expenses. Her son, humiliated in front of millions. The first sob broke from her throat before she could stop it. Then another. Betty Lou held her while she cried, and Maggie realized with horrible clarity that this was the first time she'd truly broken down since Tom's funeral 12 years ago. She'd been strong because she had to be, because Ethan needed her to be, but strength wasn't enough anymore. "Mom?" Ethan's voice came from his bedroom doorway. He'd heard her crying. She looked up, tears streaming down her face, and saw her 15-year-old son trying to comfort her. The role reversal was wrong, so fundamentally wrong. "I'm okay," she tried to say, but it came out broken. Ethan crossed the small living room and sat beside her on the worn couch. "Mom, I'm okay. It's just kids being stupid." "No." Maggie grabbed his shoulders, looking him in the eyes. Tom's eyes? "No. Tomorrow we go to the hospital. I don't care what it costs. We're going to find out what's wrong." "Mom, we can't afford—" "I don't care." Her voice was fierce now, maternal instinct overriding financial terror. "You're my son. You are everything. We'll figure out the money. We always do." That night, Maggie opened her dresser drawer and stared at the metal box she'd kept there for 12 years. Tom had given it to her a week before he died, made her promise not to open it until the time was right. She'd never been sure what that meant. Her fingers traced the rusted clasp. Not yet, she thought. But soon, she pulled out her phone instead and Googled emergency room Charleston Depot V. 80 miles away. She had $43 in her checking account, another $60 in savings earmarked for December's electricity bill. Her credit cards were maxed from Tom's funeral expenses, still being paid off in $20 increments. But her son was sick, really sick. The kind of sick that made 2-3 million people laugh instead of help. Tomorrow, she decided, tomorrow they'd drive to Charleston. Tomorrow she'd figure out how to save her son, even if it cost everything they had left. She had no idea it would cost even more than that. The emergency room at Charleston General Hospital buzzed with the controlled chaos of a Saturday morning. Maggie and Ethan had left Brooksville at 6 a.m., driving through fog that clung to the mountain roads like cobwebs. The 80-mile journey took 2 hours in Maggie's struggling Honda, and by the time they arrived, Ethan's face had gone pale with pain. Stir! Anjali Patel was 43 years old and had been working in emergency medicine for 15 years. She'd seen the video. Half the hospital staff had seen it by now, the tragic virality of a suffering child turned into entertainment. When Ethan Sullivan walked through the ER doors, she recognized him immediately. "Come with me," she said, bypassing the usual triage process. She led them to a private examination room, away from the crowded waiting area where phones might capture more footage. Ethan sat on the paper-covered table while Dr. Patel washed her hands. Maggie stood beside him, one hand protectively on his shoulder. "Ethan, I need to examine your abdomen. Is that okay?" He nodded, lifting his oversized shirt. Dr. Patel's expression remained neutral, but Maggie saw her eyes widen slightly at the sight of her son's distended belly. The doctor's hands were gentle as she palpated the swelling, pressing carefully, feeling, "Does this hurt?" "A little, mostly just feels tight." Dr. Patel pulled out a measuring tape. 38 inches, she murmured, making a note. She looked at Maggie. "How long has he been like this?" "Few months. Getting worse." "Any other symptoms?" "Fever, vomiting, changes in bathroom habits." "He doesn't eat much anymore," Maggie said. "Says he feels too full." Dr. Patel nodded, already mentally running through differential diagnoses. "I am ordering blood work, urinalysis, and an abdominal X-ray to start. Depending on what we find, we may need more tests." "How much will that cost?" The question came out smaller than Maggie intended. Dr. Patel met her eyes with understanding. "Let's find out what's wrong first. We'll work out the financial part after. Blood draws, urine samples, the cold plate of the X-ray machine against Ethan's back." They waited in the exam room for results. Maggie's leg bouncing anxiously, Ethan staring at his hands. An hour passed, then another. When Dr. Patel returned, she had a file folder and an expression Maggie couldn't quite read. Behind her was an older doctor, silver-haired and serious. "This is dear Morrison, our chief attending. I asked him to review Ethan's results." Dr. Patel sat down, and the gesture alone made Maggie's heart race. Doctor sitting down meant serious news. "Ethan," Dr. Patel began gently, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Is there any chance you've been sexually active?" Ethan's face flushed deep red. "No, never, I swear." Maggie's hand found his. "What kind of question?" "I'm asking because his blood work came back with an unusual finding." Dr. Patel opened the folder, showing them a page of numbers that meant nothing to Maggie. "Ethan's HCG level is elevated. HCG is human chorionic gonadotropin, a hormone that's typically associated with pregnancy." The room tilted. Maggie gripped the edge of the examination table. "That's impossible." "I know this is confusing," Dr. Morrison interjected, his voice clinical but not unkind. HCG can also be produced by certain types of tumors, particularly germ cell tumors. What we're seeing here suggests that something is growing in Ethan's abdomen, and it's producing this hormone, a tumor." Maggie's voice cracked on the word. "We need more imaging to be certain. The X-ray shows significant abdominal mass, but we need a CT scan to get a clearer picture." "How much does a CT scan cost?" Maggie asked, though she already knew the answer would devastate her. "Around $3,500. "Doctor," Morrison said, quietly. Maggie did the math in her head. Even if she sold everything they owned, which wasn't much, she couldn't come up with that amount. She looked at her son, sitting on the table with his swollen belly and frightened eyes, and felt the weight of every financial mistake, every missed opportunity, every limitation of their poverty crushing down on her. "I'll call Pastor Jim," she said finally. "The church has a benevolence fund. I'll figure it out." 2 days later, after Maggie had borrowed from the church, from Betty Lou, from her shift manager at Save Mart, who took pity on her, they returned for the CT scan. Ethan lay perfectly still in the machine's tunnel while radiation mapped the interior of his body. The whirring and clicking seemed to last forever. The radiologist who reviewed the images called for a consultation immediately. By the time Maggie and Ethan were brought to the consultation room, 3 doctors were waiting. Dr. Patel pulled up the images on a large screen. Even Maggie, with no medical training, could see it, a massive gray mass filling much of Ethan's abdominal cavity, pushing against organs, distorting the normal architecture of his body. "This is a teratoma," Dr. Patel explained. "A type of tumor that develops from germ cells, the cells that eventually become eggs or sperm. What makes teratomas unique is that they can contain different types of tissue." "What kind of tissue?" Ethan asked, his voice small. Morrison leaned forward. "In this scan, we can see calcifications that appear to be bone. There are also areas of different density that could be hair, fat, possibly tooth enamel. Teratomas can contain almost any type of human tissue." The room fell silent, except for the hum of medical equipment. Maggie tried to process what she was hearing. Her son had bones and teeth growing inside him. Hair, the wrongness of it made her stomach turn. Is it cancer?" she managed to ask. "Most teratomas are benign, not cancerous," Dr. Patel said. "But this one is enormous, about 15 centimeters, which is roughly 6 inches. It's compressing Ethan's stomach, liver, and intestines. It needs to be surgically removed as soon as possible." "How soon?" "Ideally within the next 2 weeks. The tumor is growing, and there's risk of rupture, torsion, or infection. Any of those complications could be life-threatening." Maggie's hands were shaking. "How much does the surgery cost?" The pause that followed told her everything. Dr. Morrison cleared his throat. "For a surgery of this complexity, including hospital stay and follow-up care, you're looking at between $150,000 and $200,000. The number hit Maggie like a physical blow. She actually gasped. $150,000. She made $26,000 a year, working 70 hours a week, even if she never ate, never paid rent, never bought a single necessity. It would take her 6 years to earn that much before taxes. "Oh, we have insurance," she said desperately, "through Save Mart. It's not great, but I pulled up your policy." Dr. Patel said gently, "It's a high-deductible plan with a pre-existing condition clause, because Ethan's symptoms started months ago. And you didn't seek immediate treatment. They're classifying this as pre-existing. They won't cover it. That's not fair. We couldn't afford to come sooner. I know. Dr. Patel's frustration was visible. I hated this system, but that's what they're saying. Maggie looked at her son. Ethan sat very still, staring at his hands, and she realized he was trying not to cry, trying to be brave, trying not to be a burden. What if we wait, she asked, 6 months, a year, if I work extra shifts, save everything, Mrs. Sullivan? Dr. Morrison interrupted, his voice firm but compassionate. Ethan doesn't have 6 months. This tumor is growing rapidly. Based on the rate of growth you've described, I'd estimate he has perhaps 3 to 4 months before serious complications develop. Rupture alone could cause septic shock and death within 48 hours. The world narrowed to a pinpoint. Her son was dying, and the only thing standing between him and treatment was money she didn't have. That night, back in their trailer, Maggie sat at the kitchen table with a notepad, writing down every asset she owned. The trailer itself worth maybe $18,000 if she could find a buyer quickly. Her car, $1,200 at best. Furniture, clothes, the old radio, Tom's tools, maybe another $1,000 total. Even if she sold absolutely everything, she'd have $20,000. Nowhere near enough. Betty Lou suggested GoFundMe. People do it all the time now, honey. You tell your story. Folks help out. Maggie had resisted at first. Pride was a stubborn thing, even in the face of desperation. But Ethan's words changed her mind. Dad would want you to ask for help. Mom, she set up the campaign at midnight, sitting in the harsh light of the kitchen, typing on her phone with trembling fingers. The title felt like an admission of failure. Save my son from the pregnancy that's killing him. She wrote about Ethan, about Tom's death from an untreated shrapnel wound because they couldn't afford the surgery, about working 2 jobs and still falling short, about her quiet, gentle boy who was dying because they were poor. She attached the medical records, the CT scan images, the bill estimates. Betty Lou shared it on Facebook. Pastor Jim sent it to the congregation. Mr. Henderson posted it at his auto shop. By the end of the first week, they'd raised $340. The comments section became a battleground. Supportive messages, praying for you, shared to my page, mixed with cruelty that took Maggie's breath away. Why should we pay for your trailer trash kid? Get a real job instead of begging. This is why poor people shouldn't have children. Probably fake. Scammers everywhere. Maggie read them late at night after her shifts. Each one a small knife wound. Ethan found her crying at 2 a.m, deleted the app from her phone, and took over responding to comments himself. His replies were polite, factual, attaching medical documentation to prove the legitimacy of their need. A few supporters rallied, defending them against the trolls. The donations trickled in. $20 from a retired teacher, $50 from a veterans organization, $10 from a single mother in Ohio who wrote, "I understand." After 2 weeks, they'd raised $4,700, still desperately, impossibly short. Early December brought new complications. Ethan's abdomen measured 40 inches now. He could barely walk without pain. Sleep was impossible lying down. So he spent nights in Betty Lou's old recliner, sitting upright, trying to find a position where the tumor wasn't crushing his organs. He stopped going to school entirely. What was the point? The video had made him infamous. His email was full of messages from strangers some kind, many cruel, a few bizarrely sexual from people with disturbing fantasies about male pregnancy. He deleted them all without telling his mother. One morning, Maggie came home from her overnight shift at the diner to find Ethan collapsed on the bathroom floor, vomiting. His skin was hot to the touch. "We're going to the hospital," she said, fear making her voice sharp. "Mom, we can't afford—" "I don't care." At Charleston General's ER, Patel took one look at Ethan's fever, 103.2 degrees, and admitted him immediately. Blood cultures showed early signs of infection. The tumor pressing against his intestines was creating conditions for bacterial growth. "If this becomes septic," Dr. Patel told Maggie privately, "it's a medical emergency. Septic shock can kill in 48 hours. Ethan stayed in the hospital for 3 days, IV antibiotics, bringing the fever down. The bill was $8,000. Maggie signed the payment plan paperwork without hands that had forgotten how not to shake, committing to payments she had no idea how to make. On the third night, while Ethan slept fitfully in his hospital bed, Maggie sat in the waiting room watching the local news. A human interest story came on about doctors who volunteered in developing countries, providing free surgery to children who'd never otherwise receive care. One doctor featured was Dr. Rachel Bennett, a surgeon from Boston who'd spent 3 weeks in Guatemala performing cleft palate repairs. "Everyone deserves access to medical care," Dr. Bennett said to the camera. "Where you're born, how much money you have, it shouldn't determine whether you live or die." Maggie stared at the television, at this woman who looked so clean and professional and certain, and felt something bitter rise in her throat. "Easy to say when you have money," she thought. "Easy to be noble when you're not the one choosing between your child's life and financial ruin." She had no way of knowing that in 2 weeks, this same doctor would see her son's story and make a decision that would save his life. That doctor, Rachel Bennett, had her own ghosts, her own debts to pay, that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. But for now, Maggie sat alone in a hospital waiting room, watching her son's medical debt climb higher, while the GoFundMe remained frozen at $6,500, and wondered how much longer she could hold on before everything shattered completely. Jake Miller had lost his son to leukemia 5 years ago. Nathan had been 7 years old, bright-eyed and obsessed with dinosaurs. When the diagnosis came 3 months later, after Jake had exhausted his savings, maxed every credit card, and begged every relative for loans, Nathan died anyway. Not because the treatment didn't exist, but because Jake couldn't afford enough of it fast enough. The bankruptcy papers were still on his desk when he saw Ethan Sullivan's GoFundMe. Jake was 35 now, working as a blogger after losing his journalism job at the Charleston Gazette when the paper downsized. His site, Appalachian Voices, covered stories the mainstream media ignored: coal town poverty, opioid crisis casualties, veterans denied benefits. He had 20,000 followers, mostly locals, who couldn't afford newspaper subscriptions but could read his work for free. Ethan's story hit him like a fist to the chest. The viral video, the tumor diagnosis, the impossible medical bills. It was Nathan's story all over again, just with different details. He read Maggie's desperate plea, studied the medical documentation, and made a decision. He drove to Charleston General Hospital unannounced. Maggie was in the cafeteria, nursing a cup of coffee she couldn't afford but needed to stay awake, when a stranger approached her table. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Jake Miller. I write for Appalachian Voices." He held out his hand, noting the exhaustion in her eyes, the coffee trimmer in her fingers. "I'd like to help tell your son's story." Maggie's first instinct was to refuse. They'd had enough exposure, enough strangers judging their poverty, their choices, their desperate circumstances. But something in Jake's face stopped her, a recognition of shared pain. "Why?" she asked simply. Jake sat down without invitation. "Because I lost my son to the same system that's failing yours. And because nobody should have to watch their child die because they're poor." He explained his plan. A video interview with Ethan, something more personal than the viral cafeteria humiliation, something that showed the human being behind the medical crisis, posted on his blog, shared through his networks, picked up by regional news if they were lucky. "Will it help?" Maggie asked. And the hope in her voice nearly broke him. "I don't know," Jake admitted, "but it can't hurt." They filmed in Ethan's hospital room the next day. Jake brought a simple camera setup, nothing fancy. He'd learned that polished production made stories feel distant, but raw footage made them real. Ethan sat propped up in bed, IV line in his arm, hospital gown loose around his swollen middle. He looked younger than 15, small against the white sheets, but his voice was steady when he spoke. Jake asked simple questions. "Tell me about your dad. What do you want to be when you grow up? What's it like carrying this tumor?" Ethan talked about Tom Sullivan, the Vietnam veteran who came home with shrapnel in his liver and lived with it for 10 years because surgery cost too much. About how his father died when Ethan was 3, from an infection that stemmed from that old wound. About the irony of history repeating itself, father and son, both carrying something inside them that would kill them if left untreated. "He had a bullet fragment," Ethan said, looking directly at the camera. "I have this tumor. People at school called me pregnant, made it into a joke. Turns out something is growing inside me, just not what they thought." He talked about his mother, working 70 hours a week, selling everything they owned, still coming up short. About the Chevy Impala sitting under a tarp in their yard, his father's unfinished project that Ethan dreamed of restoring someday. "I don't want to die because we're poor," he said finally, and his voice cracked just slightly. "That's not fair. My dad died that way. I don't want my mom to lose both of us to the same system." Jake posted the 12-minute video at 8 p.m. on December 16th. He titled it simply, "15-year-old's last plea, I don't want to die because we're poor." By midnight, it had 50,000 views. By morning, 500,000. Regional news picked it up, then national. By the third day, 2 million people had watched Ethan Sullivan speak his truth into a camera, and the GoFundMe exploded. $4,000 became $28,000, then $45,000, then $65,000. Messages flooded in from across the country, parents who'd faced similar nightmares, medical professionals horrified by the system they worked within, strangers moved by a teenage boy's quiet dignity in the face of death. But even $65,000 wasn't enough. The hospital needed $50,000 as a deposit before they'd schedule surgery, and the full cost still loomed at $150,000 minimum. They were closer, tantalizingly closer, but still impossibly far. December 18th. While Maggie was packing their few belongings for the trip back to Brooksville, her phone rang with a Boston area code. Mrs. Sullivan, my name is Rachel Bennett. I'm calling about your son. Maggie's heart stopped. Another bill collector, she assumed. Another person calling to remind her of debts she couldn't pay. I'm working on the payments. No, I'm not calling about money. I'm calling to offer help. Rachel's voice was professional, but carried an undercurrent of emotion she couldn't quite hide. I'm a surgical oncologist at Massachusetts General Hospital. I saw Jake Miller's video about Ethan. I'd like to perform his surgery. Pro bono. All costs covered. Maggie sat down on the hospital bed, legs suddenly unable to support her. What? I'll cover the surgery, the hospital stay, all related medical expenses. I've already contacted Charleston General and requested Ethan's medical records for transfer. Why? The question came out as barely a whisper. Why would you do this? Rachel was quiet for a moment. Because I can, and because every child deserves a chance to live, regardless of their parents' bank account. That wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough for now. The phone call to Jake Miller came next. He arrived at the hospital within an hour, camera ready. When Maggie told him the news, she watched this grown man who'd lost his own son sit down and cry. You need to take this, he said, wiping his eyes. You need to get on a bus to Boston and let this doctor save your boy. They left on December the 22nd, boarding a Greyhound at 6 a.m. with one duffel bag between them. Betty Lou saw them off, pressing a bag of sandwiches into Maggie's hands and a small wooden cross into Ethan's. Pastor Jim had taken up a collection $300 for food and expenses. It wasn't much, but it was everything the community could spare. The bus ride should have taken 18 hours. Maggie held Ethan's hand as he slept fitfully against her shoulder, his body fighting the fever that kept threatening to return. In her lap, she held something she'd finally allowed herself to open Tom's metal box. She'd kept it sealed for 12 years, respecting his wishes to open it only when the time was right. As the bus rolled through mountains shrouded in winter fog, Maggie finally understood the time was right when you needed your loved one's strength most. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a bullet fragment, the piece of shrapnel that had killed him slowly over a decade. Below it, a letter in Tom's handwriting, the paper yellowed with age, and beneath that, something that made Maggie's breath catch, an ultrasound image from 2002, faded but still visible, showing 2 small dots. Her hands shook as she unfolded the letter. My dearest Maggie and Ethan, it began. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And your mom finally opened the box. I'm sorry I made you wait, but some truths are too heavy to carry before you're ready. Tom wrote about the shrapnel lodged near his liver, how he'd lived with it for 10 years after coming home from Vietnam, about the doctors who told him surgery would cost $50,000, money they didn't have, not with a newborn and Maggie's nursing school debt, about his decision to live with the pain, to stretch out whatever time he had, praying it would be enough to see his son grow. I kept a bullet in my body because I was afraid, he wrote, afraid of the cost, the debt, of becoming a burden to the family I loved more than life. But Ethan, if you're reading this, don't be like me. Fight for your life. Son, you're worth every penny, every sacrifice, every prayer. Don't let money decide whether you live or die. Your life has value that can't be measured in dollars. The letter continued, Tom's words blurring through Maggie's tears. I see you in my dreams. Ethan, grown and strong, working on that Impala we'll never finish together. I see you happy. Make that real. Live the life I couldn't. It was signed with a shaky hand. Love, always, Dad. Maggie pressed the letter to her chest, crying silently so she wouldn't wake Ethan. Tom had known. He'd known his wound would kill him, had lived with that knowledge for years, choosing poverty over surgery because he couldn't bear to bankrupt his family. And now their son faced the same impossible choice. But this time would be different. A stranger with her own ghosts was offering salvation. The bus broke down in Pennsylvania at 2 a.m. Ethan's fever spiked to 104 degrees, his body shaking with chills despite the blankets Maggie wrapped around him. Other passengers stared as the driver called for an ambulance, their expressions ranging from concern to annoyance at the delay. A local emergency room in a small Pennsylvania town admitted Ethan for stabilization. The doctor on duty, a young resident named Marcus Webb, recognized him immediately. You're the kid from the video, the one going to Boston? He'd already started an IV moot, pushing fluids and antibiotics. Don't worry about the bill. We'll mark it as charity care. Small mercies in a broken system. A medical transport van donated by a local veterans organization who'd seen Jake's article drove them the rest of the way. They arrived at Massachusetts General Hospital at 10 p.m. on December 23rd. Ethan barely conscious, Maggie holding Tom's bullet fragment in her closed fist like a talisman. Dr. Rachel Bennett was waiting in the lobby. She was 52, gray starting to thread through her dark hair, with the kind of competent authority that came from decades of saving lives. But when she saw Maggie and Ethan emerge from the van, something in her professional mask cracked slightly. Mrs. Sullivan, Ethan, she extended her hand, and Maggie noticed it trembled just barely. I'm Bennett. Welcome to Boston. Maggie wanted to thank her, to fall to her knees in gratitude, to somehow express the overwhelming relief of finding someone who cared whether her son lived, but all that came out was a broken sob. Rachel did something then that doctors aren't really supposed to do. She pulled Maggie into a hug. This stranger from West Virginia, who'd lost so much, and held her while she cried. We're going to save him, Rachel said quietly, and her voice carried the weight of an oath. I promise you, we're going to save your son. Over Maggie's shoulder, Rachel looked at Ethan, sandy blonde hair like his father's, frightened hazel eyes, one hand pressed against the massive tumor distorting his thin frame. She saw Tom Sullivan's face in his features, saw the ghost of the man her father had turned away 17 years ago. This was her chance at redemption. Her father had failed Tom Sullivan, but she wouldn't fail his son. They moved Ethan to a private room that had already been arranged. Medical staff descended with practiced efficiency, vitals checked, blood drawn, IV medications adjusted. Rachel examined him personally, her trained hands palpating the enormous tumor with professional detachment that hid her horror at its size. The surgery is scheduled for Christmas Eve morning. She told them 6 a.m. It's going to take somewhere between 6 and 8 hours. The tumor is massive, and it's compressed several vital organs. There are risks: bleeding, infection, organ damage. But this alternative is letting it kill him, and that's not acceptable. Maggie signed consent forms with shaking hands. Ethan, lucid for the first time in days, looked at Rachel with the kind of desperate hope that can break a person. Bennett, will I be able to fix cars after that's what I want to do? Restore my dad's Chevy? Rachel felt something twist in her chest. That's the plan, kiddo. You're going to restore that car and drive it wherever you want to go. As they settled Ethan for the night, sedatives, pulling him toward sleep, he mumbled something that only Maggie heard clearly. Dad's here. Mom. He came with us. Maggie kissed his forehead, clutching the bullet fragment that had killed his father. I know, baby. He's always been here. Christmas Eve morning arrived cold and dark. At 5 a.m., the surgical team began preparing operating room 3 while Maggie sat beside Ethan's bed, holding his hand as pre-op medications made him drowsy. I'm scared, Mom, he whispered, his words slurring slightly. I know, baby, but Dr. Bennett is going to fix you. You're going to be okay. What if I'm not? What if I die like Dad? Maggie's throat closed. She leaned down, pressing her forehead to his. Your father fought every day to stay with us as long as he could? He would have given anything for a doctor like Rachel Bennett. You have what he never got, a real chance. You take it, Ethan. You fight. Will you tell him I tried? You're going to tell him yourself someday when you're old and gray and you've lived the most beautiful life. Her voice broke, but not for a very long time. They wheeled him away at 5:30. Maggie watched until the surgical doors closed behind the gurney, then collapsed into the nearest chair. Betty Lou had flown in overnight, arriving at 4 a.m., and now she sat beside Maggie, holding her hand in the pre-dawn darkness of the waiting room in operating room 3. Rachel Bennett scrubbed her hands with methodical precision, watching through the window as anesthesia put Ethan under. Her surgical team assembled 6 people who'd volunteered to work Christmas Eve for free because she'd asked. Because this case mattered. Ready, Cole? Her assistant surgeon asked. Rachel took a deep breath. She'd performed thousands of surgeries in her 30-year career, but none had ever carried this much weight. This wasn't just about removing a tumor. This was about correcting her father's failure, about proving that some debts could be repaid, even across the grave. Let's save this kid's life, she said. The first incision came at 6:07 a.m., a vertical cut from sternum to below the navel, opening Ethan's abdomen in one long line. Blood welled immediately. The tumor had such an extensive blood supply that bleeding was inevitable. Hour 1 passed with careful dissection, exposing the massive growth that had taken over so much of Ethan's abdominal cavity. It was even larger than the scans had suggested, pressing his liver upward, his stomach to the side, his intestines compressed into twisted positions. Suction, Rachel commanded, and her resident cleared the surgical field. We need more light here. Hour 2 brought the moment of discovery. Rachel began opening the tumor capsule to drain its contents before removal, a standard procedure for large teratomas. Her scalpel cut through the thick wall, and fluid began to leak out. She widened the opening carefully, preparing to evacuate the mass. Then she saw what was inside. Rachel's hands froze mid-movement. The surgical instruments trembled in her grip. "Doctor!" The scrub nurse's voice seemed to come from very far away. Rachel couldn't speak. Inside the tumor, illuminated by the harsh surgical lights, were structures that should not exist. Fully formed teeth, 12 of them arranged in rows, like a primitive jaw, long strands of silky blonde hair, the same color as Ethan's, growing from what looked like scalp tissue, fragments of bone ribs, vertebrae, a portion of skull, and there, most horrifying of all, tissue that resembled developing brain matter, gray and convoluted. "Oh, my God," she breathed. Her assistant surgeon leaned closer, and Rachel heard his sharp intake of breath. "Is that—" "Yes." Rachel's voice was barely audible behind her surgical mask. "It's a highly differentiated teratoma. It's developed structures that look like—" She couldn't finish the sentence. It looked like a fetus, an incomplete, impossible fetus with hair and teeth and bones, preserved inside Ethan's body for 15 years. The assisting surgeon spoke what they were all thinking. "It's like he was carrying his twin." Rachel had read about cases like this in medical literature: fetus, in fetu, vanishing twin syndrome, teratomas that developed from absorbed siblings, but reading about it and seeing it were entirely different experiences. This wasn't just tissue. This was what remained of another human being, Ethan's twin who'd never fully developed, who'd been absorbed into his body in the earliest weeks of pregnancy. "We need to keep going," Rachel said, forcing her hand steady. "This changes nothing about the procedure. It's still a tumor. It still needs to come out." But her mind was reeling. Maggie's ultrasound photo flashed in her memory. 2 dots that had become 1. This tumor was the physical manifestation of that lost twin. Cells that had remained dormant for 15 years before, suddenly, inexplicably growing. Hours 3 and 4 became a delicate dance of cutting and cauterizing. The tumor had adhered to multiple organs, and separating it without causing damage required painstaking precision. Blood loss mounted. The anesthesiologist called out numbers: 2 units, transfused, then 3. "We need to move faster," Rachel said, but she couldn't rush. One wrong cut could sever the portal vein, lacerate the liver, perforate the intestines. Speed had to balance with caution. Hour 5 brought complications. Ethan's blood pressure dropped suddenly 90/60, then 80/50. His heart rate climbed to 140. "He's going into shock," the anesthesiologist announced. "Push more blood, more epi," Rachel commanded, not looking up from her work. They were so close. The tumor was almost free. "We're almost done." But the bleeding was worsening. Every blood vessel she cauterized seemed to spawn 2 more. The surgical field became a red lake despite constant suctioning. Hour 6 brought the moment Rachel had been dreading. The heart monitor's steady beep became erratic, then went flat, a single, endless tone. "He's in V-fib," someone shouted. "Start CPAP." Rachel stepped back as the anesthesiologist began chest compressions, hands pumping Ethan's small chest in rhythmic thrusts. "Charge to 200. The defibrillator whined as it charged. "Dear!" While Ethan's body jolted, the monitor stayed flat. Again. 200. Another shock. Another jolt. Nothing. Rachel looked at the clock. 6 hours and 43 minutes. They were so close to being done. The tumor sat in a surgical basin, removed, but at terrible cost. 300, she said, her voice steady despite the fear threatening to choke her. Charged to 300. The third shock delivered its violent jolt through Ethan's chest. For 3 eternal seconds, the monitor showed nothing. Then a blip, another, a weak but present heartbeat. "We've got him back," the anesthesiologist said. Relief thick in his voice. Rachel exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. "Okay, let's close him up before he crashes again." The final hour was a race against time and trauma. Rachel closed the abdominal cavity in layers. Her hands, working with practiced efficiency, while her mind calculated odds. He'd lost too much blood. His body had been under anesthesia too long. The cardiac arrest, even brief, could have caused damage. At 2:15 p.m., 8 hours and 8 minutes after the first incision, the surgery was complete. Rachel stripped off her gloves, her gown, and walked directly to the waiting room without stopping to clean up. Maggie stood the moment she appeared, Betty Lou beside her, both women's faces pale with exhaustion and terror. "Is he alive?" Maggie's voice cracked on the question. "Yes," Rachel said. "He's alive." Maggie's legs gave out. Betty Lou caught her, lowering her back into the chair, while Maggie sobbed into her hands. Rachel sat down heavily across from them, suddenly aware of how tired she was. The surgery was successful. "We removed the tumor completely, 8.2 kilograms, roughly 18 pounds. But there were complications. He arrested during closure. We got him back. But he's critical. The next 24 hours will be crucial. Can I see him?" "Soon. He's in recovery now. Then he'll be moved to ICU. Give it 2 hours." Maggie looked up, tears streaming down her face. Thank you for saving my baby." Rachel nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her own throat. She hadn't told them yet about what was inside the tumor, about the teeth and hair and bones, about the twin brother Ethan had carried unknowingly for 15 years. That conversation could wait, for now, against impossible odds. The boy was alive, but Christmas Eve was far from over, and the real battle was just beginning. 6 p.m. on Christmas Eve, and Maggie finally stood beside her son's Ashku bed. Ethan looked impossibly small among the machines, ventilator breathing for him, monitors tracking every heartbeat, IV lines snaking into both arms. A long vertical incision ran down his abdomen, held together with staples that looked brutal against his pale skin. She took his hand carefully, avoiding the IV. His fingers were cold. "You did it, baby," she whispered. "You're so strong, just like your dad." The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm. Ethan didn't respond, kept under deep sedation to let his traumatized body begin healing. Maggie pulled a chair close and settled in for what she knew would be a long night. Betty Lou had gone to find a hotel room, but Maggie wouldn't leave, not for food, not for sleep, not for anything. She sang softly, the song Tom had loved, "You send me, honest you do." But yet, 10 p.m., a nurse came to check vitals and frowned at the thermometer reading. His temperature's up, 103.8. Dr. Bennett appeared 20 minutes later, called back from the on-call room where she'd been trying to rest. She examined Ethan with practiced efficiency, but Maggie saw the concern tightening her features. "We're running blood cultures," Rachel explained. "Post-surgical fever can be normal, but this is quite high. We're starting broad-spectrum antibiotics as a precaution." "What does it mean?" "Possibly an infection at the surgical site, or from the IV lines. Could be a reaction to the transfused blood. We won't know until the cultures come back, but we're treating aggressively." Maggie watched the fever climb through the night. 104, 104.5. Ethan's body, already devastated by 8 hours of surgery and cardiac arrest, now fought an enemy it couldn't afford to battle. Midnight came and went. Christmas morning arrived while hospital machines beeped their sterile carols. Rachel returned at 12:30 with results that made her expression grave. The blood cultures are positive for bacteria. He has sepsis, a blood infection. It's spreading faster than the antibiotics can control it. What does that mean? But Maggie already knew. She'd watched Tom die of infection from his old wound. She recognized the signs. "It means we need to take him back to surgery. There's likely an abscess, a pocket of infection near the surgical site. We need to drain it and clean the area before the infection overwhelms his system completely." He just survived 8 hours of surgery. How can he survive more? Rachel met her eyes with painful honesty. "I don't know, but if we don't do this, he'll die. Septic shock is fatal without intervention." They took him back to the OR at 1 a.m. on Christmas morning. Maggie wasn't allowed to follow this time. Emergency procedures had different protocols. She was left in the waiting room, alone except for Betty Lou, who'd rushed back from the hotel in a taxi. "I can't lose him," Maggie said into the empty air. "Not like this. Not after everything." Betty Lou had no platitudes to offer, just her solid presence and her hand to hold. The hospital chapel was 2 floors down. Maggie found herself walking there at 2 a.m., leaving Betty Lou to watch the surgical board. The small room was empty, just her and a simple wooden cross on the wall. She knelt, something she hadn't done since Tom's funeral, and for the first time in 12 years, she prayed with complete surrender. "I can't do this alone anymore. I've tried, God. I've tried so hard, but I can't lose him. Take me instead. Take everything I have. Just please, please let my baby live." Her tears fell onto cold tile. Christmas carols played faintly through the hospital speakers. Silent night. The irony, cruel, nothing about this night was silent or holy. It was machinery and infection and a 15-year-old boy dying despite everyone's best efforts. Rachel Bennett found her there at 3 a.m. Maggie looked up, terrified, but Rachel sat down beside her on the floor, still in surgical scrubs. "He's alive. We found the abscess and drained it. But Maggie..." She paused, and Maggie heard something in her voice she hadn't before. Uncertainty, fear. "The infection is aggressive. We've started him on to the strongest antibiotics we have. But his body is exhausted. The next 24 hours will determine whether he can fight this off." "Tell me the truth, is he going to die?" Rachel was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. I've done everything I can medically. The rest is up to him, and to whatever force you believe in." They sat together in that small chapel, doctor and patient's mother, both exhausted, both frightened. "Mrs. Sullivan." "Maggie, I need to tell you something," Rachel began. "It's about your husband, about Tom." Maggie turned to look at her, confused by the sudden topic change. My father was Dr. Harold Bennett. In 1999, he had a practice in Lexington, Kentucky. Your husband came to him needing surgery to remove shrapnel from his liver. The air left Maggie's lungs. What? My father refused to treat him because Tom didn't have insurance. He turned him away. Rachel's voice was steady, but her hands shook. Tom died 8 years later from complications of that untreated wound. My father could have saved him, and he chose not to. Maggie stood abruptly, anger flooding through exhaustion. Your father let my husband die. Yes. Rachel stood too, facing her. My father made a terrible choice, and it haunted him for the rest of his life. He died in 24, and his last words to me were to find your family and make it right. Make it right. Maggie's voice rose. Tom is dead. My son grew up without a father. You think surgery can fix that? No, nothing can fix that. But when I saw Ethan's video, when I saw Tom's face and your son's features, I knew I'd been looking for you for 4 years. So this, Maggie gestured wildly toward the surgical wing, this is guilt, penance. You're trying to save your father's soul by saving my son. Maybe, Rachel admitted. Does it matter why I came if Ethan lives? The question hung between them. In the distance, a monitor alarm sounded, then silenced. Your father was a coward, Maggie said, her voice shaking. Tom served his country. He came home wounded, and your father turned him away like he was garbage. I know. Rachel's own tears were falling now. My father wasn't a monster. He was a doctor, trapped in a broken system, who made an unforgivable choice. He couldn't live with what he'd done. It destroyed him. Good, Maggie spat. I hope guilt ate him alive. It did. They stared at each other across 3 feet of space that felt like a canyon. Rachel Bennett and Maggie Sullivan, connected by tragedy across 17 years, by one man's death and another boy's desperate fight for life. A nurse appeared in the chapel doorway. Little Bennett. He's seizing. They ran. Ethan's body convulsed on the ICU bed, muscles contracting violently despite the sedation. Rachel shouted orders, medications, adjustments to the ventilator, monitoring brain activity. The seizure lasted 90 seconds that felt eternal. When it finally stopped, Ethan lay still, too still. His heart rate's becoming irregular, a nurse said, alarm clear in her voice. Rachel studied the EKG strip printing out in jagged lines. The infection is affecting his heart. Start him on. The monitor flatlined with that terrible, endless tone. Code blue, someone shouted, and suddenly the room was full of people. Rachel began chest compressions while others prepared medications, charged the defibrillator, coordinated with practice crisis efficiency. Maggie was pulled from the room, dragged away by a nurse while she screamed her son's name. Betty Lou caught her in the hallway, held her while she collapsed, while the code blue alarm rang through the ICK, while Christmas morning crept toward dawn. 6 minutes. They worked on Ethan for 6 minutes? Inside the room, Rachel performed compressions with mechanical precision, her mind counting. Abdomen, brain death, begins at 4 minutes without oxygen. They were past that now. Even if they got him back, there might be damage. Clear, the defibrillator delivered its shock. Nothing. Again, another shock. The line stayed flat. Rachel looked at the clock. 6 minutes, 20 seconds. She thought of her father, of Tom Sullivan, dying slowly from neglect, of the cosmic injustice of history repeating itself. "No," she said aloud. "Not this time. Charge to 300. Doctor, we've already—" "I said charge to 300. The highest setting, the last resort." Rachel placed the paddles herself. "Clear!" Ethan's body arched off the bed with the voltage. For 3 eternal seconds, nothing happened. Then a blip on the monitor. Another, weak, irregular, but a heartbeat. "We have sinus rhythm," the anesthesiologist announced. Disbelief in his voice. Rachel stepped back, her arms trembling from the compressions. Ethan was alive. Barely, impossibly, but alive. They let Maggie back in 10 minutes later. Ethan looked even worse than before. More machines, more medications. The ventilator doing all his breathing now. His skin had taken on a gray pallor that terrified her. "He's very sick," Rachel said quietly. She stood in the doorway, looking as exhausted as Maggie felt. "His heart is being damaged by the infection. His kidneys are showing signs of stress. We're doing everything medically possible. But Maggie, you need to prepare yourself." "For what?" "For him dying." "Yes." The word hung in the air between them, terrible in its honesty. Maggie sat beside the bed, took Ethan's hand, and began to speak. She told him about his father, about Tom's letter, about the bullet he'd carried for love, about the sacrifice he'd made. She told him about the Chevy waiting at home, about the life ahead of him, about all the reasons he needed to fight. "Your dad sent to Bennett," she whispered. "I'm sure of it now. He couldn't save himself. But he sent someone to save you, so you fight. Ethan, you fight like a Sullivan." Rachel stood in the doorway, listening. Maggie's anger had been justified, her accusations fair. But hearing her tell Ethan that Tom had sent Rachel, that this was somehow providence rather than guilt, something inside Rachel's chest loosened slightly. Christmas morning dawned gray and cold. In ICU Room 7, a boy hovered between life and death while machines breathed for him. His mother held his hand and prayed. A doctor watched from the doorway, carrying ghosts she couldn't bury. And in West Virginia, in a trailer park, an old radio crackled to life unbidden, playing "You Send Me" to an empty room. December 26th, 10 a.m. Ethan's fever broke. The thermometer read 102, then 100, then 99.8. The antibiotics, after 48 hours of seeming futility, had finally gained the upper hand. Rachel stood at the foot of his bed, reading the chart with cautious relief. His white blood cell count is dropping, blood pressure stabilizing. "I think he's turned the corner." Maggie hadn't left the bedside in 2 days. She looked up with eyes so exhausted they could barely focus. "He's going to live?" "I think so. Yes." The words seemed to unlock something in Maggie. She put her head down on the edge of Ethan's bed and sobbed, not from grief this time, but from relief so profound it felt like drowning and surfacing at the same moment. By evening, they'd reduced his sedation. At 4:17 p.m., Ethan's eyes fluttered open. The first thing he saw was his mother's face, tears streaming down her cheeks, smiling wider than he'd seen in months. "Mom?" His voice was barely a whisper around the ventilator tube. "I'm here, Pippi. You're okay. You're going to be okay." They removed the ventilator 2 hours later. Ethan's first real words, after the tube came out and he could speak clearly, were, "Is it gone?" "Yes," Maggie said, squeezing his hand. "The tumor is gone. You're free." Ethan closed his eyes, and a tear slipped down his cheek. "I heard Dad. When I was wherever I was, he was telling me to fight." Maggie's throat closed. She pulled Tom's letter from her pocket. She'd been carrying it, folded against her heart. "He wrote you something? Do you want to hear it?" She read him the letter in the dimming evening light. Tom's words reaching across 12 years of death to speak to his son. When she finished, Ethan was crying openly. "He carried a bullet up. I carried—" He paused, looking down at the long line of staples bisecting his abdomen. What was it really? Rachel, who'd been standing quietly in the doorway, stepped forward. "May I explain?" Ethan nodded. She pulled up a chair, and in calm, clinical terms, she told him about teratomas, tumors that grow from germ cells, cells that should become eggs or sperm, but sometimes go astray, about how these tumors can contain any type of human tissue. "What was in mine?" Ethan asked. Rachel hesitated, glancing at Maggie, who nodded permission. "Teeth, hair, bone structures, ribs, vertebrae, part of a skull, neural tissue that resembled developing brain matter." She paused. "Ethan, your mother was pregnant with twins. One twin was absorbed very early in the pregnancy, but some of those cells remained in your body. They stayed dormant for 15 years, then began growing. What we removed was, in a sense, your twin sibling." The room fell silent except for the beep of monitors. "I was carrying my brother," Ethan said slowly. "Or sister." "Yes. The medical term is fetus in fate, though this was technically a teratoma, but yes, essentially, you carried your twin with you all this time." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, processing. Maggie watched emotions play across his face: shock, sadness, something she couldn't quite identify. Was it alive? "No," Rachel said gently. "It was tissue, not a viable organism. It had no consciousness, no awareness. But it was part of you genetically, your sibling in the most literal sense." "So I wasn't alone," Ethan whispered. "Even when I felt alone, I wasn't. He was with me." Maggie took his hand. "You were never alone, baby." That night, while Ethan slept naturally for the first time in days, Rachel asked Maggie to join her in the consultation room. The pathology report sat on the desk between them. The tumor was completely benign, no cancer. We removed it entirely, and the margins were clean. "Ethan is cured." Relief crashed through Maggie again, but Rachel's expression held something else. "There's more I need to tell you about why I really came." Over the next hour, Rachel told the full story about her father to Harold Bennett, who turned away Tom Sullivan in 1999, about how Harold had kept Tom's file, unable to forget, unable to forgive himself, about how he'd made Rachel promise, on his deathbed, to find the Sullivan family. "I've been searching for 4 years," Rachel said. "I had your names, but you'd moved from Kentucky back to West Virginia. No forwarding address. Then Jake Miller's video appeared, and I saw Tom's face and Ethan's features. I pulled my father's old files and confirmed it." Maggie listened, her anger from the chapel returning, but tempered now by exhaustion and complexity. "My father wasn't evil," Rachel continued. "He was a doctor in 2001 when health care costs were spiraling and insurance companies were denying everything. He had 3 kids in college, a struggling practice, mountains of his own debt. When Tom came to him needing expensive surgery without any ability to pay, my father panicked. He told himself Tom could find another surgeon, get charity care somewhere, that it wasn't his responsibility. But it was," Maggie said quietly. "Yes, it was. And my father knew it. The guilt destroyed him. He developed depression, started drinking. By the time he died in Twinklewood, he was a shell of the man he'd been. His last coherent words to me were, 'Find Tom Sullivan's family. Make it right. Don't let me die having done nothing.'" Rachel's hands trembled on the table. "I can't bring Tut back. I can't give Ethan his father, but I could save his life. That's why I came. Not just charity, not just medical mission, atonement." Maggie was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, Boston sparkled with late December lights. "You want me to forgive you," Maggie said finally, "or forgive your father?" "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know the truth. The truth is, your father was a coward," Maggie said. But her voice lacked the venom from before. "He let a veteran die because he was afraid of the cost. Tom served his country, came home wounded, and the country he served abandoned him. Your father was just one more person who turned away. I know. But you didn't turn away. You came when Ethan needed you." Maggie's voice cracked. "You saved my son's life. I owed him that. Maybe." Maggie looked at her, this woman who'd flown across the country, performed 8 hours of surgery for free, stayed up for 2 days fighting infections, brought Ethan back from cardiac arrest twice. "But dead or not, you did it. Tom he would thank you." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve thanks." "Probably not," Maggie agreed. "But you're getting it anyway. My son is alive because of you. I can hate your father and still be grateful to you. Both things can be true." They sat in silence. 2 women, bound by tragedy and salvation, by one man's death and another boy's survival. "There's something else," Rachel said. "The Sullivan Bennett Foundation." "What?" "Your GoFundMe raised over $400,000. After medical expenses, there's still significant money left. I'd like to help you start a foundation to help other families like yours. Rural families facing medical bankruptcy, veterans who can't afford treatment, kids dying because they're poor." Maggie stared at her. "Why would you do that?" "Because my father failed Tom. But maybe, together, we can make sure other families don't face the same choice. Maybe we can't fix the whole broken system, but we can help the people who fall through the cracks. I don't know anything about running a foundation." "I do. I'll help. We'll do it together, your experience, my resources, and medical connections. We'll call it the Sullivan Bennett Foundation. Tom's name and my father's, together. A reminder that redemption is possible." Chiseki thought about Tom, about the letter he'd written, telling Ethan to fight, to not let money decide whether he lived or died, about the bullet fragment she still carried in her pocket. "Okay," she said, "let's do it." 3 days later, they transferred Ethan to a regular room. He could walk short distances now, though his abdomen remained tender and the incision angry. Physical therapists worked with him daily, teaching his body how to balance without the 18-pound tumor he'd carried for so long. Jake Miller visited, bringing his camera and a genuine smile. "You're famous, kid," he said, setting up for an interview. 2 million people have been following your story. They want an update. Ethan, sitting up in bed, managed a weak smile. "Tell them I'm okay, and tell them thank you. I wouldn't be here without them." The interview went viral. Again, Ethan's quiet dignity, his gratitude, joy, his lack of bitterness. In the video, he showed the long surgical scar, talked about carrying his twin unknowingly, about his father's letter. "My dad carried a bullet in his body because he couldn't afford to remove it," Ethan said to the camera. "I carried my brother. We both carried things we couldn't see that were slowly killing us. But Dad didn't get the help he needed. I did. That's not fair, and it shouldn't be that way." The video ended with Ethan holding up a small photograph Tom in his Army uniform, young and hopeful. "This is my dad. He was a hero, and I'm going to live the life he couldn't. I'm going to restore his car, and I'm going to help other kids who are like me. Poor kids who get sick. They deserve to live, too." January 3rd, Ethan was discharged. They'd stayed in Boston longer than planned, but Rachel had arranged temporary housing, an apartment near the hospital for follow-up care. Paid for 6 months. You don't have to do this," Maggie protested. "No, I want to," Rachel said simply. But by mid-January, Maggie was homesick for West Virginia, for Betty Lou, for the familiar poverty that was at least hers. Rachel arranged for a local oncologist to handle Ethan's follow-up care, and they boarded a bus home. Betty Lou picked them up at the station, crying and hugging them both. The trailer park looked exactly the same, though their old lot was empty. Now the trailer sold. Someone else living their former life? They stayed with Betty Lou temporarily, while Maggie searched for a new place. The GoFundMe money meant they weren't desperate, but Maggie was careful with it, knowing it needed to fund the foundation to help others. On February 14th, Ethan returned to Brooksville High. He was nervous, remembering the cafeteria, the video, the mockery. Maggie offered to homeschool him, but Ethan refused. "I'm not hiding anymore," he said. He walked through the front doors at 7:30 a.m., his shirt covering the scar, but unable to hide how much thinner he was, how his clothes hung loose now. The hallway went quiet as students noticed him. Ethan braced himself for laughter, for cruelty. Instead, someone started clapping, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire hallway was applauding. Students he didn't know came up to shake his hand, to say they'd been praying, they'd donated, they'd followed his story. Brad Hutchins, the linebacker who'd started it all, approached with his head down. "Sullivan, I'm sorry, what I did was messed up. You're tougher than anyone I know." He extended his hand. Ethan stared at it for a moment, then shook it. "Thanks," he said simply. That afternoon, after school, Maggie took Ethan to see something. They drove to a small house with a garage, their new rental. Modest, but theirs. Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought on distant shores, but in hospital rooms and against bills we can't pay. Ethan and Maggie's story reminds us that the weight we carry isn't always visible. Tom carried a bullet for a decade. Ethan carried his twin for 15 years. and Maggie carried the weight of loving them both through impossible circumstances. This is what we do for family. We sacrifice, we endure, we fight, even when the system seems designed to make us fail. But here's the truth that makes my heart full. Salvation came from an unexpected place. Durr. Bennett carried her father's guilt and transformed it into grace, a stranger's kindness, a community's donations. One video that made millions stop and care. These small mercies added up to a miracle. And when Ethan walked back into that school and heard applause instead of mockery, when he stood in front of his father's restored Chevy with his mother beside him, that's when we understand what truly matters. It's not about the money we have or don't have. It's about showing up for each other, about second chances, about turning our deepest regrets into someone else's salvation. That's the America I still believe in. What act of kindness changed your life when you needed it most? Have you ever had to choose between medical care and financial survival? Share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters, and someone needs to hear they're not alone.